The cassette tape stopped spinning, and Detective Sarah Coleman stared at the ancient recorder with trembling hands. She had driven 6 hours into the heart of East Texas following a lead that most would dismiss as conspiracy theory madness, but the voice on that tape, the desperate whisper of a woman named Martha Sinclair, had haunted her dreams for 3 weeks. The recording was dated September 15th, 1999, and it was the last communication anyone ever received from Haven Valley, the isolated religious community that had thrived in the pine forests of Cherokee County since 1974. Martha's voice cracked through the static like broken glass. "They're coming for the children tonight. Brother Jacob says it's time for the great cleansing, but I seen what happened to the Hendersons last month. They didn't go to Dallas. Like everyone said, they went down into the earth, down where the old symbols are carved, and the mirrors show things that ain't there." Sarah rewound the tape and listened again to the part that made her blood turn cold. 427 of us came here, seeking God's truth, but something else found us first, something that's been sleeping in these woods. Since before the Cherokee walked this land, it feeds on faith, and it's been feeding for 25 years. The recording ended with a sound that forensics couldn't identify, something between a whistle and a scream. Now Sarah stood at the rusted gates of Haven Valley, her FBI credentials feeling as useless as paper in a storm. The settlement sprawled across 300 acres of dense woodland where towering pines blocked out most of the autumn sun, creating a perpetual twilight that seemed to swallow sound itself. Not a single building showed signs of life. No cars, no voices, no movement, except for the wind that carried whispers in a language she couldn't understand. Sarah's partner, Detective Mike Torres, emerged from behind their patrol car, carrying a flashlight and looking skeptical as always. "You really think we're gonna find 400 people hiding in these woods?" Sarah, she wanted to tell him about the dreams that started after she first heard Martha's tape, dreams where she walked through endless corridors lined with mirrors that reflected faces she'd never seen before, faces of people who seemed to be screaming silently for help instead. She checked her service weapon and headed toward the main gate. The sign was hand-painted in faded blue letters, Haven Valley Faith Community, founded 1974, a place where God's light shines eternal. But someone had scratched deep gouges through the word eternal and carved something else underneath. Torres squinted at the scratches. "What's that say?" Sarah traced the crude letters, with her finger feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "It says hungry." They walked past the gate, and immediately the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. First building they encountered was a modest chapel with a bell tower that leaned at an unnatural angle, as if the earth beneath it had shifted or been hollowed out. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like newspaper, but Sarah could see shapes moving behind the paper, shapes that didn't move like people. "Torres, you seeing this?" But when she turned around, her partner was gone. She called his name and heard only the echo of her own voice bouncing off the trees like a lost soul searching for home. The chapel door hung open, just wide enough for a person to slip through, and from inside came the sound of singing voices raised in harmony. But the words were wrong somehow, twisted into syllables that made her teeth ache. Sarah drew her weapon and approached the doorway. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, she heard Martha Sinclair's voice again, not from the tape recorder, but from somewhere deep inside the chapel. "Detective Coleman, you came, just like the mirrors said you would." Sarah stepped through the doorway and immediately understood why no one had ever found the missing residents of Haven Valley. The chapel was impossibly vast, stretching back into darkness far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions could contain. Hundreds of mirrors lined the walls, each one reflecting not her image but the faces of people she'd never met, people with hollow eyes and mouths opened in silent screams. Standing at the altar was a man in a simple black suit who looked exactly like the photographs she'd seen of Brother Jacob Thorne, the community's founder and spiritual leader, the man who should have been dead for 15 years. He smiled, and his reflection split across a dozen mirrors, creating an infinite army of smiling faces. "Welcome, Detective." We've been waiting so very long for you to join us." Behind him, the darkness began to move, and Sarah realized with growing horror that what she had mistaken for empty space was actually filled with people. 427 people standing, perfectly still with their backs turned toward her, all of them wearing the same black clothing, all of them humming the same wordless tune, and as she watched, they began to turn around one by one, revealing faces that were no longer entirely human. Feast of Mirrors. Sarah's finger froze on the trigger as the first row of figures completed their turn. Their faces were smooth as river stones, with features that seemed to shift and blur like reflections on disturbed water. Brother Jacob stepped down from the altar, his footsteps echoing with a metallic ring that shouldn't come from wooden floors. "Don't be afraid, Detective. The transformation is quite peaceful once you stop fighting it." Sarah backed toward the door, but found only solid wall where the entrance had been moments before. Mirrors surrounding her began to pulse with their own inner light, and she could see movement in each reflection. Crowds of people in different clothes, from different time periods, all of them trapped behind the glass, all of them reaching toward her with desperate fingers. "You're wondering about the missing persons reports, aren't you?" Jacob continued, moving closer with each word. 23 people vanished from Cherokee County between 1974 and 1999. Hikers, campers, lost travelers who stumbled upon our little community. He gestured to the mirrors with pride. Each one of them became part of our family, part of our eternal feast. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What are you?" "We are what remains when faith turns hungry. Detective, when devotion becomes consumption, we came to these woods seeking God's truth, and we found something far older, something that had been waiting beneath the Cherokee burial grounds for centuries." The figures in black began to move closer, forming a circle around her. Their humming grew louder, and she realized it wasn't humming at all, but the sound of countless voices speaking the same word over and over again, in a language that predated English, predated Cherokee, predated any human tongue. "Feed, feed, feed." Jacob reached into his coat and withdrew an antique hand mirror, its surface black with age. This was the first mirror we found buried beneath the chapel foundation when we broke ground in 1974. It showed us visions of a different kind of paradise, one where hunger never ends and satisfaction never comes. He held the mirror toward Sarah, and she saw her own reflection, but her face was changing, becoming smooth and featureless like the others. The Cherokee knew what slept here. They called it the Wendigo's mirror, the hunger that devours from within, but they made the mistake of trying to contain it rather than feed it. Sarah's vision began to blur, and she felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch the black mirror, to let whatever lived behind its surface flow into her and fill the emptiness she'd carried since her brother died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. "That's it, Detective. Let the hunger and you recognize it, don't you? That hollow ache that nothing seems to fill." Her hand moved toward the mirror against her will. Around her, the figures began to change, their smooth faces splitting open to reveal rows of needle teeth, their bodies stretching and contorting into shapes that hurt to look at. "We've been adding to our family slowly, Detective, 1 or 2 travelers each year, but never enough to satisfy what lives in the mirrors. It wants more. It wants to spread beyond these woods. And you're going to help us." Sarah's fingers were inches from the mirror's surface when she heard Torres calling her name from somewhere impossibly far away. The sound broke the spell, and she jerked her hand back. The chapel erupted in shrieking as the figures lunged toward her with inhuman speed. Sarah spun around, desperately looking for escape, and saw a crack of daylight where the door should be. She dove through the gap as claws raked across her back and found herself rolling down a steep hill behind the chapel. Torres was running toward her, his face pale with worry. "Sarah, where the hell did you go? I've been looking for you for 20 minutes. She scrambled to her feet and looked back at the chapel. It was empty and had clearly been empty for years. The windows weren't covered with newspaper, but with layers of dust and grime. The door hung from broken hinges. "Torres, how long was I in there?" In where Sarah, you've been standing next to the car this whole time just staring at that building like you were in some kind of trance. Sarah checked her watch. Only 5 minutes had passed since they'd arrived at Haven Valley, but her back burned where the claws had touched her, and when she looked at her hands, she could still see traces of that otherworldly darkness under her fingernails. We need to search the other buildings, she said, knowing even as she spoke the words that they would find nothing, or rather they would find exactly what the mirrors wanted them to find as they walked deeper into the abandoned settlement. Sarah noticed that every building had mirrors in the windows, all of them reflecting not the surrounding forest, but images of people who looked like they were trying to screen the children's house. The third building they approached made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. It was smaller than the chapel, painted in cheerful yellow with a hand-lettered sign that read, Little Lamb's Learning Center, but the paint was peeling away in strips that looked disturbingly like human skin. Torres pushed open the door and immediately stepped back. Jesus Christ, Sarah, what is that smell? The odor hit her like a physical blow, sweet and cloying with undertones of something rotten, something that had been dead for a very long time. Inside the building, tiny chairs were arranged in a perfect circle around a large mirror that had been mounted on the floor like a window into the earth below. Children's drawings covered the walls, but as Sarah looked closer, she realized they weren't typical crayon scribbles. Every picture showed the same thing, a tall figure in black standing beside a dark mirror, with dozens of small shapes kneeling before it. Shapes had no faces. Look at this, Sarah. Torres was examining a shelf filled with children's belongings, backpacks, lunch boxes, stuffed animals, all arranged with disturbing precision, as if their owners might return at any moment. Sarah picked up a small pink diary and opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone very young, or very frightened. October 13th, 1999, brother. Jacob says tomorrow is the day of great joy when we get to join the others in the mirror place. I don't want to go. I seen what happens when you look too long at the mirrors. You forget who you are. You forget your mama and daddy. You forget everything except the hungry feeling. But brother Jacob says the hungry feeling is God, and we have to feed it. Mary Beth tried to run away yesterday, but the mirrors brought her back. They always bring you back. She's different. Now she don't talk, and her eyes look like the surface of deep water. I'm gonna hide this diary under my mattress, and maybe someday somebody will find it and know what really happened to us. Please, if you're reading this, don't look in the mirrors. Don't listen when they whisper your name. The hungry thing been waiting so long, and it's getting stronger. Sarah closed the diary with trembling hands behind her. Torres had gone silent. When she turned around, she found him staring into the large mirror. In the center of the room, his reflection wasn't alone. Dozens of children stood behind his image, their faces pale and hollow, their mouths moving as if they were speaking, but no sound emerged. Torres, don't look at it. But he was already stepping toward the mirror as if drawn by invisible strings. Sarah grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back, but he was surprisingly strong. They're trying to tell me something, Sarah. They need our help. In the mirror, the children began to gesture, frantically pointing at something behind Sarah. She turned and saw that the walls were covered with more mirrors, mirrors that hadn't been there moments before. Each one showed a different scene: children being led down stone steps into underground chambers, kneeling before an altar made of black stone, brother Jacob standing over a well that seemed to have no bottom, and in every mirror the same tall figure watched from the shadows, a thing that might have once been human but had been twisted by centuries of hunger into something else entirely. The Wendigo, Sarah whispered, remembering Jacob's words. But this wasn't the creature of Algonquian legend. This was something older, something that had been feeding on human devotion and faith for millennia, something that turned worship into consumption and love into hunger. Torres was now standing directly in front of the floor mirror. His reflection had changed. Instead of his familiar face, Sarah saw the features of a young boy, maybe 8 years old, with tears streaming down his cheeks. Sarah, Torres' voice sounded different, younger, Sarah, help me. I can't remember who I am. The mirror began to crack from. The fissures came the sound of children singing a lullaby that Sarah recognized from her own childhood. But the words were wrong. Rock-a-bye baby in the mirror, deep when the glass breaks. The baby will keep feeding and feeding until nothing remains, just the hungry dark and the endless pain. Sarah grabbed Torres by the shoulders and shook him hard. Remember who you are, Michael Torres, badge number 4471. You have a wife named Elena and 2 kids, Sophia and Marcus. You coach Little League on weekends. For a moment, his adult features returned. But then the mirror pulled him back, and Sarah watched in horror as his reflection began to age rapidly. 10 years old, 15, 20, 30, and then beyond normal aging into something ancient and withered. It's showing me the truth, Sarah. We've all been here before, all of us, every person who's ever disappeared in these woods. We keep coming back, lifetime after lifetime, to feed the thing in the mirrors. Sarah felt her own memories beginning to shift. Suddenly, she could remember being a little girl in a yellow dress standing in this same room, watching as other children were led away into the darkness. She remembered the taste of fear and the feeling of something vast and hungry pressing against the edges of her mind. No, she said aloud, those aren't my memories. But even as she spoke, she wasn't sure. The mirrors were showing her a different version of her life, one where she hadn't become a detective, but had instead lived and died in Haven Valley decades ago, one where her brother hadn't died in Afghanistan, but had been taken by the mirrors when they were both children. Sarah, look. Torres pointed to the largest mirror in its surface. Sarah could see the entire history of Haven Valley playing out like a movie. 1974, Brother Jacob and his original followers arrive and begin construction. 1975, they discover the Cherokee burial ground and the mirrors buried beneath it. 1976, the first disappearances begin as the mirrors start calling to travelers. 1999, the final harvest when all remaining members of the community are absorbed into the mirror realm. But the story didn't end there. Sarah saw herself as she really was, not a detective, but a former resident of Haven Valley who had escaped as a child and had her memories altered. She saw Torres, too, a man who had lost his own family to the mirrors years ago and had spent his life searching for them. They weren't here by chance. They were here because the mirrors had called them home, and now, after 25 years of patient waiting, the thing behind the glass was ready to complete its feast. Underground truth. The floor beneath them began to vibrate and crack. Through the widening fissures came the sound of something immense moving far below the chapel foundations. Sarah grabbed Torres' hand and ran for the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. The mirrors on the walls began to glow with phosphorescent light, and she could see shapes moving behind the glass, not reflections but actual beings pressing against the barrier between worlds. Sarah, a child's voice called from the largest mirror. Sarah, come home. She knew that voice. It was her brother, Danny, the brother who had supposedly died in Afghanistan, but whom she now remembered had vanished into these very mirrors when they were children living in Haven Valley. 25 years ago, Danny, she whispered. His face appeared in the glass, pale and translucent, but unmistakably him. I've been waiting so long, sis, waiting for you to remember who you really are. Behind Danny, she could see hundreds of other faces, all the missing members of Haven Valley, all the travelers who had disappeared over the decades, all of them trapped behind the mirrors, feeding the hunger with their own spiritual energy. The Cherokee were right to fear this place. Danny continued, but they made one mistake. They tried to contain the Wendigo instead of destroying it. They buried it alive under tons of stone and sacred symbols, but hunger, that old, doesn't die. It just sleeps and dreams and grows stronger. The building shook again, and Sarah realized they were directly above some kind of vast underground chamber. When Brother Jacob's people broke ground for the chapel, they cracked the Cherokee containment. The mirrors were never just mirrors, Sarah. Their windows, their doorways, and their feeding tubes. Torres gripped her hand tighter. His face had gone completely pale, and she could see his adult memories warring with older, deeper recollections. I remember now, he said. I wasn't a detective. I was one of the children. Here my real name is Miguel Hendricks. My family came to Haven Valley when I was 12. Sarah felt her own false memories crumbling like a house of cards. She remembered her parents, Ruth and David Sinclair. She remembered the day they packed everything. They owned into their old station wagon and drove to Haven Valley seeking spiritual enlightenment. She remembered how excited she and Danny had been about living in a real religious community where everyone shared everything and worked together for God's glory, and she remembered the night everything changed. October 31st, 1999, Halloween the night. Brother Jacob called it the Feast of Mirrors. All the children had been gathered in the chapel while the adults went down into the underground chamber to prepare for what Jacob called their transition to a higher plane of existence. But Sarah had snuck out through a broken window in the children's dormitory. She had hidden in the woods and watched as one by one the adults emerged from the underground chamber. Only they weren't adults anymore. They moved wrong, their bodies twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, and when they spoke, it was in voices like breaking glass. She had watched them gather the children and lead them down stone steps that appeared in the chapel floor, steps that led into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. Danny had been in that group. Her little brother had looked back once as they descended, and his eyes had been empty as mirrors. Sarah had run that night run until she collapsed on a highway 20 miles away where a state trooper found her. They had taken her to a foster home, and when she tried to tell them about Haven Valley, they said she was suffering from trauma-induced delusions. They said her parents had died in a car accident. They said she'd never had a brother named Danny. They gave her new memories, a new identity, a new life, but the mirrors had been patient. They had waited 25 years for her to grow up, to become strong enough to feed their master properly, and now she was here, and the feast could finally be completed. Sarah, brother Jacob's voice echoed from somewhere below them. It's time to come home. The floor split open, revealing stone steps that descended into phosphorescent darkness. The bottom of the steps, Sarah could see them all, 427 residents of Haven Valley standing in perfect rows facing a massive mirror that seemed to be carved from a single piece of obsidian. But they weren't people anymore. They were husks, hollow shells that moved only when the thing behind the mirror commanded them, and at the center of it, all towering above them, like some nightmarish conductor, stood the true master of Haven Valley, not brother Jacob, but the thing that had been wearing his face for 25 years. The thing that the Cherokee had called the Wendigo, but which was older and hungrier than any legend could contain. It looked up at Sarah with eyes like black mirrors and smiled with a mouth full of needle teeth. "Welcome home, daughter," it said in a voice that was every voice she had ever loved. "Time to feed the family." Keeper of souls, Sarah stared down into the underground chamber as the full horror of Haven Valley's truth finally revealed itself. Creature wearing brother Jacob's face was ancient beyond measure, its true form shifting between human appearance and something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of primitive mankind. Around it, the 427 residents stood motionless, their bodies preserved by whatever dark force had claimed them, but their eyes hollow and empty. 25 years ago, you escaped before the harvest was complete. The thing that had been Jacob spoke, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. But you were always meant to return. Sarah always meant to complete the circle. Torres gripped her hand so tightly she could feel her bones grinding together. "What happened to the real brother Jacob?" he called down. Creature laughed and its form flickered, revealing glimpses of rotting flesh beneath the human disguise. Jacob Thorne died in 1978. 3 years after founding this community, but his faith, his absolute devotion to finding divine truth made him the perfect vessel for my awakening. The massive obsidian mirror behind the creature began to pulse with its own inner light. "I have worn many faces over the millennia, fed on the worship of countless civilizations. Cherokee knew me as the Wendigo, but I am older than their legends, older than their people. I am the hunger that exists in the space between faith and madness." Sarah felt Danny's presence growing stronger in her mind. Her brother's voice whispered directly into her thoughts, not through the mirrors, but from some deeper connection they had shared since childhood. Sarah, the mirror isn't just a doorway, it's a prison. The Cherokee didn't just bury this thing, they bound it here, with sacred symbols carved into the stone. If you can break the binding circle, it will be trapped forever. She looked more carefully at the chamber walls and saw them ancient Cherokee symbols, carved deep into the rock, forming an intricate pattern around the obsidian mirror. But several of the symbols had been defaced, scratched away by the creature's followers over the decades. Binding was weakening. You see them, don't you? The creature said, following her gaze. The symbols that have kept me tethered to this place for so long. But with each soul I consume, the bonds grow weaker. It gestured to the rows of hollow-eyed people. Every resident of Haven Valley, every lost traveler, every seeker who came here looking for truth has fed my strength, and soon I will have enough power to break free of this underground prison, to walk the earth again. As I did in the time before time, Sarah realized with growing horror that the creature wasn't just feeding on the people, it was using their life force, their spiritual energy, to erode the Cherokee binding. But first, the creature continued. I need the final sacrifice, the one soul that escaped my grasp 25 years ago. You, Sarah Sinclair, are the key to my freedom. Torres pulled her back from the edge of the opening. We have to get out of here, he whispered, but the creature heard him and laughed. There's no escape, Miguel Hendricks. You know this place too well to believe otherwise. Suddenly Sarah understood. The entire settlement above ground was just an illusion, a projection maintained by the creature's power. The real Haven Valley existed only in this underground chamber. They had never been walking through abandoned buildings. They had been wandering through the creature's memories, its psychic recreation of the community it had destroyed. Sarah, Danny's voice was more urgent. Now the symbols, you have to complete the binding before it gets strong enough to break free. She looked at the defaced Cherokee carvings and saw what needed to be done. Symbols formed the containment circle, but several sections had been deliberately destroyed. If she could carve the missing pieces back into the stone, the binding would be complete again. I need something sharp, she told Torres. He handed her his pocket knife. The creature below began to move toward the stone steps, its form becoming more monstrous with each step. You cannot stop what has been set in motion, it snarled. I have fed on faith for 25 years, absorbed the devotion of hundreds of believers. My power is absolute. Sarah knelt beside the wall and began carving the first missing symbol into the stone. Cherokee writing was complex angular patterns that seemed to shift and move under her hands. The moment her knife touched the rock, the creature screamed a sound like every nightmare-given voice. The hollow-eyed residents of Haven Valley began to move, turning toward the stone steps with mechanical precision. Stop her, the creature commanded. They obeyed without question, climbing the stairs with jerky, inhuman movements. Torres stepped in front of Sarah, drawing his service weapon. I don't think bullets are going to work on these things, he said, but when he fired the first shot, something unexpected happened. The bullet passed harmlessly through the approaching figure and struck the obsidian mirror behind them. The mirror cracked, and from the crack came a sound like the world ending. All 427 residents collapsed at once, their bodies crumbling to dust that was instantly absorbed by the fractured mirror. No, the creature roared. My sustenance, my power. Sarah continued carving, fighting against exhaustion as the creature's rage pressed against her mind like a physical weight. 2 symbols complete. 3, 4. With each symbol, the creature grew weaker, but also more desperate. I will not be contained again, it shrieked, transforming into something that was pure hunger given form. I will devour this world as I have devoured countless others. Sarah carved the 5th symbol. The 6th binding circle was almost complete, but the creature had reached the stone steps, and Sarah realized with crushing despair that she wouldn't have time to finish. Then Torres did something that surprised them both. Turned his gun on the obsidian mirror and emptied his entire clip into its surface. The ancient glass shattered completely, and, with it, the creature's power broke like a dam. Bursting, Sarah now, Danny's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Finish it. She carved the final symbol just as the creature reached for her with claws that could tear apart reality itself. Moment the binding circle was complete, the Cherokee. Symbols blazed with white-hot light. The creature froze mid-lunge, its form beginning to unravel like smoke in a hurricane. "This is not possible," it whispered as its stolen human appearance fell away, revealing something that predated human civilization. "I am eternal, I am hunger itself." Sarah stood and faced the dying monstrosity. "You're nothing," she said. "Just a parasite that feeds on faith, and you picked the wrong faith to devour." The creature collapsed inward on itself, becoming smaller and smaller, until nothing remained but a patch of scorched stone. The underground chamber began to shake and crack. "We need to get out of here," Torres shouted. But Sarah was already moving, not toward any exit, but toward the space where the obsidian mirror had stood, because she could hear them calling all the souls that had been trapped for 25 years, all the residents of Haven Valley who had been consumed by an ancient hunger. They were free, and they were finally going home. Price of truth: 6 months. Later, Sarah sat in her car outside the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department, staring at the official report that would close the Haven Valley case. Forever missing persons file officially resolved. All 427 residents declared legally dead, 'cause unknown. No bodies recovered. The truth was far simpler and far more terrible than anything that would ever appear in an official record. Sarah and Torres had emerged from the underground chamber as it collapsed behind them. They had found themselves standing in an empty field where Haven Valley had once existed. No buildings, no roads, no sign that a religious community had ever called this place home. Only evidence of what they had experienced was the Cherokee symbols carved into a single standing stone, symbols that were already beginning to fade as nature reclaimed the site. Torres had been transferred to a desk job in Houston. Trauma of recovering his real memories, the knowledge that his wife and children were constructs created by the creature to give him a false life, had broken something fundamental in his mind. Sarah visited him sometimes, but he rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask when he could go home to a family that had never existed. Home to a life that had been nothing but psychic imprisonment. Sarah had fared better, but only barely. She had resigned from the FBI and taken a job as a night security guard at a Houston museum. The isolation suited her. During the long, quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she could almost pretend that her memories were real, that Danny had actually died in Afghanistan, that her parents had been killed in a car accident, almost. But every morning when she looked in the mirror, she saw the truth. She saw a woman who had escaped something that should have been impossible, a woman who had helped destroy a creature that had fed on human faith for millennia, a woman who carried the memories of 427 souls who had finally found peace. The hardest part wasn't the nightmares or the paranoia or the way mirrors sometimes showed her things that weren't there. The hardest part was Danny, because unlike Torres' false memories, Danny had been real. Her brother really had existed, really had loved her, really had been trapped behind the mirrors for 25 years. And when the creature died, when the obsidian mirror shattered, Danny had been released. She had seen him one last time as they fled the collapsing chamber, a translucent figure standing among the other freed souls. He had smiled at her and mouthed the words, "Thank you, sis." Then he had faded into whatever comes after. Sarah closed the official report and started her car tonight. She was driving back to Cherokee County, not to the place where Haven Valley had existed, but to the Cherokee Reservation 20 miles south. She had an appointment with an elder named Joseph Nighthorse, a man who claimed his grandfather had been one of the shamans who originally bound the creature underground. Joseph had been expecting her call. My grandfather left instructions. He had told her over the phone, said someday someone would come, someone who had looked into the hungry mirrors and lived. He said that person would need to know the rest of the truth. Sarah drove through the East Texas darkness, wondering what truth could possibly be worse than what she already knew. She found Joseph waiting for her beside a fire pit behind his modest home. He was ancient, maybe 90 years old, with eyes that held the weight of generations. "Sarah Sinclair," he said before she could introduce herself. "My grandfather dreamed about you 70 years ago. Saw you in the sacred smoke, said you would be the one to end the hunger." They sat beside the fire and Joseph began to speak. "The thing you destroyed was not unique," he said. "There are others sleeping in the earth waiting to be awakened by human faith and desperation." The Cherokee knew this. Our ancestors spent centuries finding and binding these creatures. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water. How many others? Joseph poked at the fire with a long stick. "My grandfather's generation bound 7 of them, but the world has changed. There are more people now, more cities, more places where faith can be twisted into hunger." He looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "The bindings are weakening. Sarah, the symbols are fading from neglect and ignorance. Soon others will wake. And when they do, they will be stronger than the one you faced because they will have learned from its mistakes." Sarah stared into the flames, feeling a weight settle on her shoulders that threatened to crush her. "What are you asking me to do?" "What my people have been doing for 1,000 years. Guard the sleeping places. Maintain the bindings. Keep the hungry things from waking." Joseph reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that made Sarah's heart skip. It was a piece of obsidian, polished smooth and carved with Cherokee symbols. But unlike the symbols in the underground chamber, these were intact, complete, and they pulsed with their own inner light. "This will show you when one of them is stirring," Joseph explained. "It will guide you to the binding sites before the creatures can fully awaken." Sarah took the obsidian reluctantly, feeling its weight, both physical and spiritual. "I can't do this alone." "You won't be alone. There are others like you scattered across the country, people who have encountered the hungry things and survived. They will find you when the time comes." Joseph stood and walked to the edge of the firelight. "The creature you destroyed at Haven Valley was bound in 1847 after it consumed an entire town called Perdition that stood where Dallas is now. 300 people vanished in a single night, and the only trace they left behind were mirrors that showed hungry faces pressed against the glass." Sarah felt the obsidian grow warm in her hand. "Why are you telling me this?" Joseph smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and read a news story about a small religious community in Montana that has gone missing overnight. 73 people vanished without a trace." The obsidian began to pulse faster. "And you're going to know exactly what happened to them." Sarah looked down at the carved stone and saw images forming in its black surface. A mountainside chapel surrounded by mirrors, families kneeling in prayer as something vast and hungry stirred beneath their feet. A young girl escaping into the forest, carrying memories that would eventually lead her back to finish what others had started. The cycle beginning again. "This is my life now," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." Joseph nodded. "Until all 7 are destroyed. Or until they destroy you. There is no other choice. The hungry things are patient. Sarah, they can wait centuries for the right moment. But they never stop trying to feed." Sarah stood and walked back toward her car. Behind her, the fire began to die down, and Joseph's night horse faded into the darkness like smoke as she drove away. Sarah felt the obsidian pulse against her palm and knew with absolute certainty that her phone would ring before morning. Someone somewhere would call to report another impossible disappearance, another community that had vanished without explanation, another hungry mirror that needed to be shattered. Sarah Sinclair, former resident of Haven Valley, former FBI agent, current guardian of ancient terrors, drove into the Texas night carrying the weight of humanity's most dangerous secret. Behind her, the Cherokee reservation grew smaller. In her rearview mirror, ahead of her lay Montana and 73 missing souls and a creature that had been sleeping underground since before the Civil War. A creature that was already dreaming of the feast to come. The obsidian pulsed once more, and Sarah heard Danny's voice carried on the wind. "Stay strong, sis. The mirrors are always watching, and the hungry things never sleep for long." She pressed harder on the accelerator and drove toward whatever nightmare was waiting in the mountains, because someone had to, because the alternative was too terrible to consider, and because 25 years ago, a little girl had run from the mirrors and survived. That same girl now carried the power to make sure no one else would have to run ever again. Roads stretched endlessly ahead, dark and full of promises that no one should have to keep the end.